I'm a 30-year-old woman, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the afterthought in my own family. My younger brother, Ryan 27M, was always the golden child. If he wanted something, he got it. If I needed something, I was told to figure it out myself. That was the unspoken rule of our household. Growing up, it wasn't just the little things, it was everything. When Ryan wanted a new bike, my parents got him the best model. When I needed one, they told me to save up my allowance. When he turned 16, they handed him the keys to a brand new car. When it was my turn, I took the bus. He never worked a part-time job a day in his life. Meanwhile, I was balancing school, babysitting gigs, and waitressing just to afford clothes that weren't hand-me-downs. College was no different. My parents covered Ryan's full tuition, books, apartment, everything. I had to take out student loans, work late shifts, and still somehow keep my grades up. And even after all that, when I finally graduated with honors, they didn't even bother showing up to my ceremony. They were too busy helping Ryan with his newest business venture, one of many that would crash and burn while they continued to support him. I spent years trying to earn their love, their approval, something. I thought that if I was a good daughter, if I helped them financially when they struggled, if I made time for them even when they didn't do the same for me, maybe things would change. They never did. No matter what I did, Ryan was the priority. But the moment that broke me, my wedding. I met my husband, Ethan, a few years ago, and he showed me what real love and support looked like. When we got engaged, I knew my family had never really been there for me, but I still wanted them to be. I wanted my parents in the front row, watching me walk down the aisle. I wanted my brother standing somewhere in the crowd, at least pretending to be happy for me. They RSVP'd? Yes, they promised they'd be there. And yet, when I turned to look at the seats reserved for them, they were empty. Not a call, not a text, nothing. Just gone. I tried to keep it together, smiling for the cameras, focusing on Ethan and the life we were about to start together. But I kept looking back, expecting them to rush in, to be late but at least show up. They never did. Days later, when I finally got a hold of them, my mom sounded annoyed that I was even asking. Apparently, Ryan had a small emergency. His dog had an upset stomach, and they couldn't just leave him alone. That was their excuse. That was the reason they skipped my wedding. When I told them how much it hurt, my mom laughed, said I was being dramatic and it wasn't that big of a deal. My dad didn't even say anything, just let out one of those sighs that made it clear he thought this was all a waste of time. Ryan? He just said, "You're not actually mad about this, right?" As if I was the crazy one. I don't know what snapped inside me at that moment, but I hung up. I blocked their numbers. I deleted them from social media. For the first time in my life, I decided I was done trying. And the worst part, they didn't even notice. Months passed. No calls, no texts, no apologies. It was like I had never existed to them. And then, a few weeks ago, my aunt called. She isn't someone I'm particularly close with, but she sounded hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should even be telling me this. Apparently, things weren't going well for my parents and Ryan. She didn't give details, just that maybe it was time to talk, that maybe I should give them a chance to explain. I had no intention of hearing them out. I had given them years of chances, and they had wasted every single one. But then something shifted in my mind. At first, I told myself this was about closure. Maybe I needed to hear them acknowledge what they had done. But deep down, I knew I wanted to see if they had changed, if they had any regrets at all. And if they didn't, then at least I'd have my answer. So I agreed to meet them. One time. One chance. They didn't know it yet, but depending on what they said at that table, I was either walking away for good, or I was about to make them regret everything. The restaurant was already half full when I walked in, the low hum of conversation and clinking of silverware filling the space. My eyes scanned the room until I spotted them. My parents and Ryan were sitting at a corner table, looking exactly as I expected, tense, uncomfortable, like they were about to face something they wanted to avoid. My mom's eyes met mine first, and in an instant she forced a smile, the kind of smile she used when she was pretending everything was fine. Ryan was slouched back in his seat, arms crossed, staring at his phone like he had better places to be. My dad barely looked up, scrolling through something with that same detached expression he always had when he wasn't interested. I walked over, pulling out the chair across from them. No greetings, no forced pleasantries. Just straight to business. My mom was the first to speak, launching right into small talk, asking how my job was going, if I had any vacations planned, if Ethan and I were thinking about buying a house. Like nothing had ever happened. Like they hadn't ignored my wedding. Like this wasn't the first time we'd seen each other in nearly a year. I didn't answer. I just waited. Ryan was the one who broke the silence first, finally looking up from his phone with an amused smirk. Wow, so you're still mad about that wedding thing? He leaned back like this whole thing was one big joke. The air shifted. The restaurant noises faded into the background. I stayed calm. I wasn't here to lose control. I wasn't here to cry or beg for answers. I was here to see if they were capable of acknowledging what they'd done. I asked the only question that mattered. Do you even realize why I'm upset? Ryan rolled his eyes and sighed like I was being so unreasonable. My mom gave one of her dramatic sighs and shook her head. You always overreact to things. We had a family emergency. We can't drop everything for you all the time. A family emergency? I stared at her, waiting, giving her a chance to say something. Anything that would make it make sense. Nothing. So I said it for her. You're talking about Ryan's dog. You missed my wedding because of a dog. Ryan scoffed like that wasn't the full story. It wasn't just that, he said. I wasn't feeling well either. And then my dad, who hadn't said a word this whole time, finally looked up from his phone just long enough to shrug and say, "We just thought you'd understand." Understand? That was when it clicked. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about them making a mistake or forgetting or anything like that. They just didn't care. They had never cared. I had spent years thinking if I worked harder, if I was more patient, if I just gave them one more chance, maybe things would be different. But sitting across from them now, listening to them make excuses for something that should not have needed an excuse, I knew there was nothing left to salvage. I leaned forward, making sure they heard me clearly. This was your one chance to take responsibility. I said. You missed it. They exchanged confused glances, not getting it. Not understanding that this wasn't just another one of those family disagreements they could sweep under the rug. I reached into my purse, pulled out some cash, and dropped it onto the table. You'll regret this. Then I stood up and walked out, leaving them sitting there, still not grasping what had just happened. That night, I opened my laptop and started typing. I wasn't going to let them rewrite the narrative. I wasn't going to let them act like I was some dramatic, ungrateful daughter who just couldn't let things go. If they weren't going to be held accountable within the family, then the world was going to hold them accountable. I wrote everything. No exaggerations, no embellishments, just the truth. How they had always favored Ryan, how I had been treated like an afterthought, how they had chosen a dog over my wedding, and how they had sat there at that restaurant with zero remorse. I hit post. And then I waited. At first, the post got a few likes, a handful of comments from people saying they could relate. But then overnight, it started gaining traction. Someone must have shared it in a large group because suddenly notifications flooded my phone. More comments. More shares. By the time I checked again that evening, it had taken off in a way I never expected. Thousands of comments poured in, many from people who had been through the same thing. I thought I was the only one. My parents did this to me too. I cut my toxic family off years ago. Best decision I ever made. The post wasn't just being read, it was spreading. People were tagging each other, reposting it, adding their own stories. By the time I woke up the next morning, it had completely blown up. A few days passed before I started noticing missed calls from my mother. At first, they were spaced out, 1 or 2 a day, but as the post continued to spread, they became frantic. The text started with simple messages, call me, now, but soon escalated into full-blown rage. Take it down immediately. You are making us look bad. Do you have any idea what you've done? Blocked. Ryan was next. A long, furious message came through, filled with all caps and exclamation points. Are you serious? Do you know how embarrassing this is? My job might see this. You literally ruining my life. Apparently, he cared more about his reputation than the fact that he and our parents had completely discarded me. At first, my dad was silent. No calls, no texts. He had always been the one to avoid conflict, acting like if he ignored a problem long enough, it would go away. But as the fallout grew, even he couldn't stay detached forever. When my mother's frantic attempts to control the damage failed, he finally reached out, not with an apology, but with an attempt to smooth things over. A single message, let's be reasonable about this support, came pouring in. Strangers messaged me, some thanking me for sharing, others telling me they were going through the same thing. Some people even gave me advice, sharing how they had successfully cut off their toxic families for good. Then my aunt texted, wow, I didn't think it would get this big. But honestly, I can't say I blame you. She didn't defend my parents, she didn't try to convince me to take it down. Just an acknowledgement that this was bigger than she had expected. By that evening, things had taken a turn. More calls, more messages. Then, the real fallout started. The family gossip train was in full motion. Extended relatives started hearing about it. Friends of my parents, even their old church group. Questions started coming their way, people wondering if it was true. Then Ryan called. The moment I picked up, he was already yelling. Someone at his job had seen the post. They confronted him about it at work. Take it down. His voice was shaking, not from anger, but from panic. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just said one thing before hanging up. The truth hurts, doesn't it? Then came the guilt trip. My mother sending voice notes, her voice breaking. You're destroying this family. After all we've done for you, this is how you treat us. As if they had ever done anything for me. I ignored them. Every single one. Then, my dad finally broke his silence. One single phone call. His voice was flat, controlled. Like he was trying to act like this was no big deal. You've made your point. Now let's be adults and move on. Move on? After a lifetime of being treated like nothing? I replied, just as calm. Adults take responsibility. You didn't. Then I blocked him too. It was over. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I needed their love, their approval, anything. I didn't need them to admit they were wrong. I had something better. Regret. And yet, I wasn't finished. The post had done its job. But now, it was time to make sure everyone knew exactly who they were. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email. Not just to my parents. Not just to Ryan. To every extended family member. To old family friends. To anyone who had ever believed my parents were good people. This wasn't just about exposing them. This was about making sure they could never rewrite the story again. This time, the truth wasn't going anywhere. The email went out to everyone. Aunts, uncles, cousins, old family friends. Anyone who had ever been fed the lie that my parents were good, loving people. I didn't hold back. I laid everything out, detailing the years of neglect, the blatant favoritism, the way they treated Ryan like a prince, while I was left to fend for myself. And of course, I included the final insult, how they had RSVP'd to my wedding and then ghosted me for a dog. The responses came in fast. Some relatives were shocked. Messages poured in from cousins and distant aunts saying they had no idea it was this bad. Others were a little less surprised, subtly implying they had always suspected something was off but didn't want to get involved. Then came the reactions from my parents' so-called friends. One of their longtime family friends, a woman my mother had been close with for years, reached out, horrified. She couldn't believe they had missed my wedding over something so petty. Another messaged me privately, saying that while they had always liked my parents, this changed everything. That's when my phone started blowing up. My mother was in full meltdown mode. Missed calls, voicemails, frantic texts, all saying the same thing. What have you done? People are turning against us. This isn't fair. She was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. Then my dad lost his indifference. For the first time in years, he actually showed real emotion, not concern, not regret, just rage. A voicemail came in, his voice shaking with anger. You ungrateful brat. You've ruined our reputation. You have no idea what you've done. I let the message sit there, I didn't respond, and while they were dealing with their social lives falling apart, Ryan was dealing with something much worse. A cousin messaged me privately, revealing something I had suspected for a while. Ryan had been mooching off my parents for years. The whole successful businessman act was just that, an act. He wasn't self-made, he wasn't independent. My parents had been quietly covering his rent, his car payments, even some of his credit card bills. And now, with their reputation crashing, his free ride was in serious danger. Then came the work fallout. Someone from Ryan's job, a coworker, maybe even a manager, must have seen the viral post because HR got involved. Turns out, his company took their reputation seriously. A meeting was scheduled, and Ryan was furious. The moment he found out, another angry call came through. He was screaming before I even said a word. "You ruined my career. Do you even care?" I waited until he ran out of breath, then asked one simple question. "What part of this isn't true?" Silence. Then a muttered curse before he hung up on me. Meanwhile, my mother was desperate to get ahead of the damage. She started sending out her own emails to extended family, painting me as some bitter, exaggerating child who was holding on to the past. She tried to spin it as if I was making a big deal out of nothing, twisting the narrative into one where she had simply made a few parenting mistakes. But this time, no one was buying it. Instead of siding with her, most of the family now saw my parents for who they really were. The ignored messages, the favoritism, the missing wedding, it was all documented. So my mother tried one last thing, a public apology. A long, overly dramatic Facebook post went up, filled with vague wording. She wrote about how she wasn't a perfect parent and how some people take things out of proportion. It was a classic non-apology, a way to make herself look like the victim while still refusing to take any real responsibility. I didn't even have to respond, because everyone else did. People started calling her out in the comments. Distant relatives started questioning her. Some of her own friends were openly disagreeing with her, saying that if she had really cared, she would have shown up to my wedding. But I wasn't done. I posted receipts. Screenshots of texts they ignored. A picture of my wedding day, with the glaringly empty seats where my family should have been. Proof that for months, they never even tried to reach out. And that was it. More people cut them off. Family group chats that once included my mother removed her. Invitations that once went out to them suddenly disappeared. And Ryan? He was spiraling. The HR meeting happened. No one knows exactly what was said, but whatever it wasn't good. A week later, word got around that he had been put on probation. Another angry call came in, but I didn't answer. The next message I got from my mother was her last, one final desperate attempt at guilt-tripping me. "You'll regret this when we're gone." I didn't respond, because for the first time I realized something. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was making sure they finally felt the consequences of their actions. And it was working. The fallout wasn't just social, it was financial, and the cracks started showing fast. A call came in from an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years. He wasn't reaching out to guilt me, but to warn me. My parents weren't as stable as they had made it seem. They had been struggling financially for a while, but instead of cutting back, they had poured everything into Ryan, keeping up the illusion that he was successful. It turned out that Ryan hadn't been paying his own rent at all. My parents had been covering it the whole time, along with his car payments, credit card debt, and whatever else he couldn't handle on his own. The money they were spending on him wasn't just casual help, it was their retirement fund. They had banked everything on Ryan eventually becoming successful enough to take care of them. Except, he never did. And now, with his job on shaky ground and their social circle turning against them, the financial house of cards was collapsing. Ryan's job probation meant he wasn't getting bonuses anymore. Without his usual paycheck, he couldn't cover his lifestyle. The rent on his apartment was due, and this time, my parents couldn't step in. Then, the first eviction notice came. His landlord wasn't interested in excuses. With rent prices going up and no guarantee of payment, Ryan was put on a final warning. If he didn't come up with the money soon, he was out. Meanwhile, my parents were facing their own nightmare. They couldn't keep up with their mortgage anymore. The loss of social standing had impacted more than just their friendships. It had hit their business connections too. My father had always prided himself on his reputation in the community, using his standing to keep his side gigs going. But now, the invitations had stopped coming. People weren't eager to work with someone whose personal life was a disaster. Then the house went up for sale. The place I had grown up in, the house where I had been treated like an afterthought, had been under financial strain for a while. Between their reliance on credit cards to support Ryan's lifestyle and my father's dwindling income, foreclosure was inevitable. They tried to hold on, even borrowing from old friends, but with their reputation damaged and their safety net gone, they were forced to downsize, moving into a much smaller home in a less desirable neighborhood. The kind of move that screamed, "We're struggling," even if they refused to admit it out loud. That's when I got the email. A long, emotional plea from my mother, disguised as a message of reconciliation. She didn't apologize, of course. Instead, she focused on how family should stick together, how no matter what, we'll always be connected, and how I was doing so well now and could help them through this tough time. I didn't hesitate. I replied with one sentence. "I thought you said I was being dramatic and overreacting? If you can't take responsibility for what you did, why should I take responsibility for you now?" Then I blocked her email. The meltdown was immediate. She tried reaching me through other numbers, leaving voicemails filled with rage, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of abandoning my own family, claiming that one day, I'd regret this. I didn't respond. Then Ryan tried. Unlike my mother, he didn't waste time pretending to be nice. His message was blunt: "You wouldn't let your brother be homeless, would you?" As if he had ever cared when I was struggling. I picked up the phone for the first time in weeks and said one sentence before hanging up: "You never cared when I had to fend for myself. Welcome to my world." Click. Blocked. The situation only got worse for them. People in their social circle started whispering. The news of their financial issues spread, but instead of sympathy, it became gossip. People talked about how they had brought it on themselves, how they had burned bridges for Ryan, how they had betrayed their own daughter and ended up with nothing. I had my suspicions. The way my parents had clung to their old social circles, the desperation in my mother's texts, it all hinted at something more than just embarrassment. Then, another call came in from my uncle. This time he confirmed it. They weren't just struggling socially, they were drowning financially. They had relied on Ryan to be their golden ticket, but his failure and their lost reputation had left them with nothing. That's when my father, the man who had never fought for me, never defended me, finally broke his silence. It's a single message. I hope you're happy now. No apology, no accountability, just blame. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in my life, I felt something I had never felt before when it came to them. Nothing at all. No guilt. No sadness. No regret. Just relief. I turned to Ethan that night and said, I'm officially done with them. No more looking back. No more hoping they'd change. And for the first time in my life, I meant it. Ryan's eviction notice wasn't immediate. At first, he tried negotiating, pleading for more time, hoping that anyone would step in to cover him. But when the final warning came and the landlord wasn't budging, reality finally hit. This time, there was no last-minute miracle. No sudden money from my parents. No one to bail him out. The landlord followed through. Ryan was kicked out of his apartment, bags in hand, with nowhere to go. His first instinct was the same as always, run back to mommy and daddy. But this time, they barely had enough to cover their own rent. The new place they had downsized to wasn't big, wasn't nice, and most importantly, wasn't free. They couldn't afford to support Ryan anymore. And for the first time in his life, he was forced to figure things out on his own. He tried couch surfing. A friend let him crash for a few nights, but Ryan was Ryan, entitled, demanding, acting like he was doing them a favor by staying there. It didn't last. One by one, every option dried up. The messages from my mother slowed, but they never stopped. At first, it was anger, then guilt, then silence. And then, out of nowhere, a final, desperate email. Not an angry voicemail, not a passive-aggressive jab, just a simple plea. Please. We have nothing left. We need you not. I'm sorry. Not we were wrong. Just we need you. I read it once. Then again. Then for the last time ever, I responded. You made your choice. Now live with it. And then, I blocked her. Emails, numbers, social media, everything. They no longer existed to me. And instead of guilt, I felt lighter than I ever had before. The silence was peaceful. No more unexpected calls, no more tense family holidays, no more waiting for an apology that was never going to come. I had finally cut the last string. Then came my father's last pathetic attempt at controlling the narrative, a Facebook post. Some long, dramatic rant about disrespectful children who abandon their family, about how kids today have no loyalty and only care about themselves. It sat there for days. Not a single like, not a single supportive comment. People had seen the truth. Meanwhile, Ryan's situation didn't collapse all at once. At first, he managed to convince a friend to let him crash on their couch for a few weeks. But his entitled attitude, complaining about the Wi-Fi, expecting food to be provided, wore thin fast. One by one, his options dried up. Even his closest friends started seeing through him. His entire life had been built around his parents covering for him, fixing things for him. But now, there was no safety net. And I wasn't the only one who saw it. My aunt and uncle, two people who had stayed quiet for a long time, reached out. Not to pressure me, not to guilt me, but to tell me something simple. We're proud of you. They had watched it all unfold. They had known my parents weren't great, but they never realized just how bad it had been. And now, they saw it clearly. And that was all I needed to hear. The months passed, and something strange happened. For the first time in my life, I wasn't dreading the holidays. No awkward family dinners. No waiting for a call that wasn't coming. Just peace. Then, one day, I did something I never thought I would. I went back to my wedding venue. I stood in the same spot where I had looked out at the empty seats that were meant for my family. I took a photo, standing right there, with those seats behind me. And this time, I smiled, because they were the ones missing out, not me. Ethan noticed it first. You've never looked this happy before. And he was right. Without them in my life, I was thriving. A month later, I hit a huge milestone at work. A big promotion. A career move I had worked my ass off for. Once upon a time, I would have called my parents, told them the good news, waited for some kind of pride, some kind of validation. But now, I didn't even think about calling them. They had been erased from my world. Of course, my mother couldn't let things end that cleanly. A new email came through. Not from her usual account, she knew she was blocked. This time, it was from a distant cousin. I opened it, scanned the first line, and immediately recognized my mother's wording. Deleted. No hesitation. No curiosity. No second thought. She had already said everything that mattered. Nothing. And Ryan? Last I heard, he had to move out of state to find work. No more easy rides. No more parents covering his mess. No one cared. And that was it. Looking back, I realized something. I never needed revenge. I just needed them to finally experience the consequences of their own actions. And they did. Even after cutting them off, the messages didn't stop. New numbers, unknown contacts, some guilt-trippy, some outright hostile. The pattern was always the same. First came the family is forever lines trying to manipulate me into responding. When that didn't work, the messages turned nasty. I ignored them all. Then, a cousin reached out with something interesting. My mother had made a fake Facebook account. Apparently, she wasn't handling being blocked well, so she did what desperate people do, created a profile under a random name and started lurking. She wasn't subtle either. She kept posting vague, cryptic statuses like, some people just don't understand what family means. People weren't stupid. It didn't take long for mutual friends to piece it together. Some even called her out in the comments. The account disappeared not long after. But Ryan? He tried something even more ridiculous. He went full victim mode. Out of nowhere, he posted a long, dramatic rant on his real social media, flipping the narrative completely. According to him, I had ruined his life and abandoned my family for no reason. He painted himself as a devoted brother who had always tried to support me and acted like I was the selfish one for cutting them off. It backfired spectacularly. The internet doesn't forget. People, some from our old social circles, some total strangers, dragged him in the comments. His past behavior, his entitlement, the fact that he had mooched off my parents for years, it all came out. Instead of sympathy, he got humiliated. And I didn't say a word. I ignored his post completely. No acknowledgement, no response. Nothing infuriates narcissists more than being ignored. Then, late one night, a random number called. I let it go to voicemail. A single message. My dad's voice. We need to talk. It's urgent. I stared at my phone for a long moment before texting back. What's wrong? Not even a minute passed before another text came through, but not from my dad. It was my mom's number. Oh, thank God, you're finally coming to your senses. There it was. The bait and switch. I already knew what this was about, but I waited. Another message. Not a health emergency. Not a family tragedy. A financial crisis. They were out of money. My dad had been struggling to keep up with bills. My mom's reputation was in the gutter, meaning her old support network had dried up. Ryan's eviction had already happened, and now, with nowhere left to turn, they were begging me for help. Just a little help. We're family. We need you. I replied with one sentence. You never treated me like family. You don't get to ask me for anything now. Silence. Then, the breakdown. The messages came rapid fire, one after another. My mother lost it, flipping between guilt-tripping and full-blown rage. How could you do this? You're selfish. You'll regret this one day. Then my dad called again. This time I picked up. He started talking, but I didn't let him finish. You only care because you have nothing left. That's not love. That's desperation. Then I hung up, blocked every new number they tried reaching me from. That night, Ethan and I went out to dinner. We toasted to something that had been a long time coming. Peace. No more unwanted messages. No more guilt. No more guilt. No more waiting for something that was never going to come. A few weeks later, a cousin confirmed what I already knew. My parents had to sell the house. The house where I had grown up feeling like a second-class family member. The house where Ryan had been spoiled and handed everything. While I had to work for every little thing I had, they lost it. And I felt nothing, because they had made their choice. And now, they were living with it. Ryan's downfall was inevitable. His job had put him on probation after the fallout from my viral post. But everyone knew what that really meant. It wasn't a second chance. It was the company waiting for the right moment to cut him loose. And that moment came. HR finally pulled the trigger. Ryan was officially fired. No more cushy paycheck. No more pretending to be successful. Nothing. That's when the couch surfing phase began. He started bouncing between friends' places, but Ryan was Ryan. Lazy, entitled, and unbearable to live with. He wouldn't pitch in for groceries. He wouldn't help clean. He acted like crashing on someone's couch was his right, not a favor. One by one, people kicked him out. With nowhere else to turn, he tried guilt-tripping our extended family. Aunts, uncles, even distant cousins. He spun the same old sob story. Natalie abandoned us. My parents are struggling. I just need a place to get back on my feet. Nobody took him in. By now, the family knew the truth. They had seen the way he was coddled, the way my parents had thrown their own retirement away for him. Nobody was going to repeat their mistake. With the guilt-tripping failing, Ryan tried one last social media pity party. A long-winded post about how families should never turn their backs on each other, how he'd been left with nothing, how his own sister ruined his life. It was the exact same playbook my mom had tried. And just like hers, it failed. People remembered who he was. They remembered the entitled, arrogant guy who never worked for anything. The guy who bragged about being better than everyone, who treated people like they were beneath him. The comments tore him apart. Instead of sympathy, he got mocked. Then, silence. No more sob stories. No more fake narratives. Just a public humiliation that he couldn't erase. Meanwhile, my parents had become pariahs. Once, they had a strong social circle. Friends, neighbors, even their church community. But after everything that had come out, that support vanished. Nobody invited them to events anymore. The church, which my mother had relied on for validation, had turned their backs on her. People stopped returning her calls. Even her closest friends distanced themselves. Then came the ultimate humiliation. A family wedding. A big one. The kind of event where my mother would have once been front and center, playing the role of the respected matriarch. But this time, nobody cared that she was there. She tried acting like nothing had happened, smiling, making small talk, inserting herself into conversations. But people ignored her. Not in a cruel way, not in an obvious way, just in a way that let her know she wasn't welcome anymore. A few people gave her fake smiles, the kind you give to someone you don't respect but also don't want to make a scene with. She left early. Then I saw a photo of my dad. A random picture that made its way to me through family. He looked different, older, tired, defeated. The weight of everything, the financial ruin, the social exile, the loss of control, was written all over his face. Then the final blow hit. With nowhere else to go, Ryan moved back in with them. 3 people, broke, bitter, and barely scraping by, trapped under the same roof. A family built on favoritism, now turning on each other. And me? I felt nothing. I had expected to feel triumphant, to feel like I had won. But mostly, I just felt free, because they had no control over me anymore. Then Ryan sent his last message ever. A single text. I can't believe you're just watching us suffer like this. I stared at it for a second. Then I typed back one last reply. Welcome to my childhood. Blocked. Forever. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I deleted every last contact from my phone. My parents, Ryan. Every number, every email, every trace of them. They didn't exist in my world anymore. And for the first time in my life, I was finally truly free. A cousin reached out for what would be the final update I'd ever receive about them. My parents had officially hit rock bottom. The house was gone, their savings were drained, and they had no choice but to move into a tiny, run-down apartment, the kind of place they used to scoff at. The golden child was still with them. Ryan, once the center of their world, was now a grown man with no job, no prospects, and no way out. He was stuck in a dead-end life, completely dependent on two parents who barely had anything left to give. The family had cut them off completely. No more holiday invites. No more birthday parties. No more fake smiles at weddings and reunions. They had alienated everyone. Even their old friends had moved on. Nobody wanted to be associated with them anymore. Meanwhile, I was thriving. Another promotion. More traveling. The kind of life I used to dream about when I was younger, stuck in a house where I was constantly overlooked. Then something poetic happened. One of my best friends got married. This time, there were no empty seats, no disappointment. I stood beside someone who valued me, who wanted me there. The wedding was beautiful, full of love, laughter, and real family. I didn't spare my parents a single thought. At the reception, Ethan leaned over and said, "I've never seen you this happy before." And he was right. The holidays came and went. No unwanted calls. No awkward conversations. Just peace. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel that familiar pang of sadness when family gatherings rolled around. Because the truth was, I wasn't alone. I had a husband who adored me. Friends who were like siblings. A real family that I built for myself. Then, therapy gave me the final answer I never realized I needed. It wasn't me. It was never me. I had spent so much of my life thinking that if I just tried harder, if I just earned it, maybe they would have loved me the way they loved Ryan. But the truth? They were never capable of love to begin with. I stopped checking for updates on them after that. Their lives? Not my concern. I had bigger things to focus on, like the family I was about to build. Ethan and I started talking about the future, about kids, about what kind of parents we wanted to be. And we both agreed we would never be like them. Then one last unexpected thing happened. A package arrived. No return address. Just a plain, old box. Inside, a collection of childhood photos, old pictures of me at Christmas, birthday parties, random family moments that I barely remembered, and buried beneath it all, a letter. From my mother. I didn't open it. I didn't even hesitate. I picked up the box and tossed it straight into the trash. No curiosity. No second thoughts. Because at that moment, I knew it was truly over. They were nothing to me anymore. And the best part, they had done it to themselves. They had made their choice. And now, I was living my best life while they faded into irrelevance.